Good morning. I don't know if is anybody back there. Oh yeah, I couldn't see you. There's a PowerPoint that just says class. Is it already up? Oh yeah, there we go. Step ahead. I don't know if that may be tiny. Sometimes it's hard to tell. You look at something on your screen and it looks pretty readable and good, and then you put it up on the PowerPoint. It's like, ooh. Mike, you're toward the back. That's pretty small, isn't it? Oh, can you say it? Okay. All right. Maybe it's legible. I'll try to read the smaller parts. Most of that we'll cover. I'm going to hold off on that. Began talking just very, very beginning part of Alexander the Great. We're studying, of course, the period between the Testaments. What I want to do, just to kind of give you a roadmap for this class, it's ambitious, I suppose, but I want to try to talk about Alexander, those who succeeded Alexander, and then get into the period of the Seleucids ruling over the Palestinian area, and that'll set the stage for what's going on with the Jews during this time. We sort of did that talking about the Persian Empire. We didn't talk about the Babylonian Empire per se. We covered that some, but there's more in the Bible about that, and we're looking more between the Testaments. But when we finished talking about Persia, the kind of the historical part of it, then we stopped and said, okay, well, let's talk about the problems, the progress of the Jews during that time. Kind of do that with as far as the Grecian Empire under Alexander. And I think I mentioned this last week. It's kind of ironic. We call this the Greek Empire, the Grecian Empire. If you recall, since the days of Xerxes, the Greek city-states had been kind of rising in power, and Persia had trouble. Of course, it's the problem when you have such a vast, huge empire. It's hard to keep everybody subjugated, everybody in submission, no problems, no uprisings and things like that. And so it became difficult, but especially when it came to the Greek city-states. So the problem, though, the reason Persia had lasted as long as it did is the Greek city-states were just that. They were city-states, but they would not, they a lot of times were just yam between them, and they wouldn't unite. Again, if they had ever united against a common foe, they would have been probably the world power. But a lot of times they're fighting amongst themselves. And as Pfeiffer points out in his book, Between the Testaments, it was Philip of Macedon who finally unites the Greeks. And, it's kind of ironic because he wasn't really a Greek. He was Macedonian, of course. But Philip of Macedon, he unites the Greeks with the exception, of course, of Sparta. Sparta was, you study world history, they didn't get along with a whole lot of people. But they formed this Hellenic League. And again, I mentioned this last week. If you hear the term Hellenistic, Hellenism, anything like that, Hellenists, it's talking about the Greek culture. That's the term for Greek culture. So you see that a lot, especially in intertestamental history. But there was this Hellenic League. It was made up of all the Greek city-states, of course, except for Sparta, and it became the death blow to the Persian Empire. But, as it turns out, Philip was murdered around 336 BC. His mantle falls on his young son, Alexander, who then begins to conquer. And as Pfeiffer puts it in his book, Alexander represented a mass of conflicting strands. He was a Macedonian by nationality, but he dreamed of national glory, world domination as the heir of Philip of Macedon. But culturally, he was a Greek, educated by Aristotle himself. I told you last week he carried around a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey with him when he went on his travels and his conquests. But here's the thing with Alexander. He was thoroughly sold, 1,000% sold, on the Hellenist or Greek way of life. I mean, he believed that culture, that ideology was superior to all others. And he sought to, and that's why Pfeiffer's chapter in the book dealing with Alexander is called Alexander, the Apostle of Hellenism. And that's really what he was. I mean, he wanted to convert the entire world to the Greek way of life. And that was kind of his mission. And who knows, had he been able to reign for much longer, may have done even more. But what he did in the short time that he did reign is pretty amazing. But he had a humble beginning, a small army, mostly Macedonians. He had a staff of historians. He loved history. He had some geographers, botanists. He crossed, is it some of you folks that are better at pronouncing things than I am? I'm not always the best at that. Dardanelle? It's spelled like Dardanelles, but I'm not sure the pronunciation. Is it Dardanelle? It sounds French, so I'm thinking it's Dardanelle. But he crossed the Dardanelle by boat at the spot where Xerxes had, actually the very spot where Xerxes had taken his army across on a carefully prepared bridge. Of course, a bridge made of boats. So he captures Troy, sacrifices to the souls of dead Greek heroes, and that basically means war is on. So that's the beginning of his conquest. And here's the thing: the Persian ruler at the time, the Persian sovereign, was Darius III. He didn't really take this seriously. And we look back and we think, how could you not take Alexander the Great seriously? What a genius he was in many ways. But of course, these events are happening in real time for them. He didn't really take this seriously. He says, will somebody just arrest that man and bring him here to Susa, to the palace, and we'll deal with him when he gets here? Well, it wasn't going to be that simple, of course. He sent an army of Persian cavalry, some Greek mercenaries, and native troops. They expected an easy victory, but of course, they clashed at the river Granicus, and the Persians were defeated. But Alexander did not pursue. He did order the Greek mercenaries executed because he felt like they were traitors to their homeland. But with the victory there at the river Granicus, now the way into Asia Minor lays open before Alexander. So, of course, he marches through. These Greek cities of Asia Minor were taken and liberated, and use that term kind of with the air quotes because as Pfeiffer tells it, and it's certainly true, many of them did not want to be liberated. Some of them weren't happy about this, of course, as always is the case. But Alexander he moves eastward. There's no serious challenge until he comes to the Cilician gates of Issus, and Darius advanced there with his Persian army. But again, the Persians fell back before Alexander. Damascus is taken by surprise. This time, though, Alexander is able to take some of the family of Darius. He takes a great amount of treasure, and there were some ambassadors from Sparta, Thebes, and Athens who were captured as well. So now Alexander has taken some prisoners and even some of the family of Darius. Again, though, he does not pursue Darius. At this point, military tactics demand that he's got to secure his rear so that he's not taken advanced upon from behind. So all the Phoenician cities except for Tyre had already surrendered, and they were occupied. 2 different occasions, Darius offers negotiation terms to Alexander. Here's what I'll give you. Just give me back my family. Let's call an end to this nonsense. He offered him territory, a lot of money. He offered his daughter in marriage if Alexander would just call this thing off. But at this point, Alexander was set. I'm going to rule the world. And so he just says, nope, no deal. And he continues on. Tyre is an interesting thing. This is what I brought. I don't know why it printed out so strange. I should have known when I was looking at this. I was printing it out this morning and was thinking, one of them said it was going to be 15 pages, and I thought that seems like a lot. But it's because it printed so that you're reading like this with a big, massive margin on either side. I don't know. But if I had known that, I would have just copied and pasted it into Word and printed it and saved a whole lot of paper. But if you want to read a lot more detail about the siege of Tyre, it is fascinating. and it was prophesied hundreds of years before it happened by a man named, not Daniel, Ezekiel. Ezekiel prophesied this way before this happened. And Ezekiel prophesied, in fact, there was years ago, there was a member of the church. He was a gospel preacher for a while. He went into the mission field. I don't really know what happened on the mission field, if it was, he was not very successful, and I don't know if that was because he was just in a tough field or because he was, some people have suggested, he was lazy. I don't know. I really don't know, but he was not very successful, and maybe that frustrated him. Maybe he ran into some skeptics or something. I don't know, but he converted out of Christianity and even the Lord's church into skepticism. His name is Farrell Teal. I don't even know. I don't know if he's still alive. I haven't heard anything from him in a long, long time. But I remember when I was college age, I was going to the University of Alabama. I had a lot of my friends who went to Faulkner, and they fixed it since then. But at that time, you could send an email and address that email to students@faulkner.edu. And guess what? It went to every single student. And this joker sent an email filled with accusations where the Bible prophecies had failed, and how that the God of the Bible can't be real, or if there is a God, it's certainly not the God of the Bible because it's so filled with error. And he sent it to every single student. And so there were some guys, probably, I'm guessing a lot of them Bible majors, some of the instructors, some of the students that really worked together and even sent some emails to the whole student body as well to try to refute and repudiate that. And many of them did a very good job. But anyway, all that just to say, Farrell Teal was one of his criticisms was the prophecy in Ezekiel. Because the prophecy starts off saying Nebuchadnezzar would lay siege to Tyre. And he points out, well, newsflash, study your history, Nebuchadnezzar didn't defeat Tyre. Because what happened? And he did lay siege to him, but what happened? Tyre actually was kind of almost like, you almost had two cities. You had the main city, we'll see this in just a moment, and then a few, several hundred, yards offshore, they were a coastal city. Several hundred yards offshore, you had an island. And so what they did when Nebuchadnezzar lays siege, and of course he cuts off all supplies, but the Phoenicians, Tyre and Sidon were Phoenician cities, but they were kind of famous for what? Ships, navy. So they just out to the island, and we need supplies. Guess what? Well, can't get them through the mainland. Big deal. Navy is our thing. We sail. So they could get supplies. Well, Nebuchadnezzar finally just kind of gives it up. He burns the city, the main city. But they're off on their little island area there, and they survive. Ezekiel prophesied other nations. Many nations would come against them. And throughout the subsequent history, that happened. Several nations would come against them. But then it goes on and it just describes the utter destruction of Tyre. And that's where Till would say, and others would say, that didn't happen. Nebuchadnezzar was never able to completely destroy and subdue the city. But it changes. In fact, this article here is the one I was going to mention. This is the longer one. If you want a more detailed study of it, it's called Tyre and Prophecy, and it's from Apologetics Press. Apologeticspress.org is the URL. You can just go type in Tyre. You'll get 3 results that pop up immediately. One is a video, if you want to watch that. I started to play it this morning, but I don't have 7.5 minutes to spare because I got too much to cover. It's a 7.5 minute video. It's not that long if you want to go watch it. But it's amazing, the evidence for inspiration of the Bible that's just within this incident in the destruction of Tyre. But Kyle's article is very, very thorough. And so what ended up happening was, what you'll notice in a careful reading of that prophecy is Ezekiel switches from talking about he, singular. And the he is whom? Nebuchadnezzar. But then, if you read it carefully, he shifts to saying they. Who's the they? He's talking about Nebuchadnezzar does some of that, but who forms the second, at least the second person there? It's Alexander. Because Alexander comes against it later on, and he will utterly defeat it. And sometimes people will talk about the prophecy in Ezekiel where it mentions that Tyre would not be inhabited, and people say, well, Tyre is inhabited to this day. But there's something else to notice with that as well. If I can I'm trying to separate these two articles because there's two of them. Like I said, if you type it in on apologeticspress.org, if you type in Tyre, Tyre, then you'll get three results. Well, you get a lot of results, but the top three are, where is that article? This is still the long article. But you'll get the top two, I think, are these two articles. The other one is by Major, and it's a little bit shorter version. Similar things, and he actually, what I liked about his article was he's got a chart that shows prediction and fulfillment. It shows prediction number 1, Nebuchadnezzar shall destroy the mainland field portion of Tyre. Shows the fulfillment of that. Of course, this is, I don't know if I mentioned it's in Ezekiel 26. Number 2, prophecy or prediction. Other nations are to participate in the fulfillment of the prophecy. And he shows where Tyre remained in subjection to Persia, but you have several nations coming against them at various times. The city will be flattened like at the top of a rock, and so on. So he goes through all those different things and the fulfillment. But this is where I want to move from this map just a second. And you'll see here, here's the mainland of Phoenicia. And so you've got this is your, somewhere we think this is the old city of Tyre, somewhere around here. Nobody really knows this for sure because what Alexander did completely changed the map. And not even intending to do that necessarily. But Alexander comes against Tyre, and just like they did with Nebuchadnezzar, okay, we got this thing figured out. Flee to the island, we'll wait you out, we can get our supplies that way. And Alexander's kind of like, you're not going to make a fool out of me. I'm going to get to you. And, as Pfeiffer points out, his persistence, we might call it stubbornness, I don't know. I guess it depends on how you want to view that. But he goes and he takes everything he can find, every piece of scrap, if it's rocks, anything he could get, and they make basically a causeway over to this island, which has basically become the new city of Tyre. Yes, sir?
I was reading about this. What he did is he destroyed the city, and all of the rocks in the city he used as stone.
Yeah, he destroyed the mainland city, that's right, and he used all the rubble from that, and he just starts telling soldiers, cast it into the sea. And so you're talking, it's, what is that? Looking at the scale's 500 yards, probably a little over, maybe 700 yards or so. I would think not more than that. But that's a long way to just throw stuff in the sea and manage to get your troops across. It's pretty impressive is what it is. It is certainly a testament to his persistence, stubbornness, whatever you want to call it. But what happened was, with this there, they didn't say when they're done, okay, let's clean up our mess. They just left it. And so what happened is, of course, sand it starts to deposit there. And now, here's what that same, you see the gap, and the gap is just closed. And so here's modern day Tyre. And I show this because sometimes people will say, oh, well, the Bible says Tyre will never be inhabited again, but here you go. Here's a map, and you can see it's clearly inhabited. Well, that's new Tyre, okay? We don't know, we're not even 100% sure where old Tyre was because it changed so much the map when Alexander did this, and all those deposits, and it's been, of course, hundreds of years, really like 2,000 years plus. So we're not even sure exactly where the first original Tyre was. Some people speculate, again, you see this down here where it says Old City of Tyre, but we don't know that for sure. So Alexander, that occupied him for some 7 months. Now, here's a guy, he's bent on conquering the world, but it takes 7 months for one city. That shows he is rather persistent, stubborn, but also, of course, as we said, he's kind of got that mentality, if you're not going to make a fool out of me, I'm going to teach you a lesson. So that was his conquest of Tyre, and then after a 2-month siege in Gaza, then Alexander was wounded there. The victorious Macedonians, now they're moving on to Egypt. The Egyptians hated the Persians. They were glad to see Alexander come there, and so it's funny, they had Alexander enter the temple of Ammon, and the oracle announces, Alexander is the son of Ammon. Isn't that something? And he's going to conquer the world. So I like what Pfeiffer says in his book. He says the Hellenism of Alexander must have worn thin when he accepted the role of a son of Ammon, because that's thoroughly Egyptian. And Alexander was all about Hellenism, right? But, whatever you got to do to get people to like you and help you conquer the world, I guess. But I basically say that about Egypt just to say this. He established a city there. And that city became very important then. He invited some Jews to settle there. They did. And it's going to have a lot of bearing on the course of the history of Jews, but also even the early church. What's the name of that city? Alexandria. We sometimes talk about these humble rulers and naming cities after themselves. Madison, will you do me a favor? Will you run there in my office? I think it's on my desk somewhere, and bring my iPad, please. My iPad. I just realized I just totally forgot to print out an entire section, and I just realized I don't know if I'm gonna be able to pull it up on there, so I can. Y'all bear with me, because I can't multitask. Thank you so much. That may show up in the folder where I saved my PowerPoints, but I've got access to that on my iPad. Jewish tradition does show Alexander in a friendly light. We've mentioned this, we touched on this once before. Josephus tells a story about Alexander coming to Palestine. The high priest goes out to meet him in his full priestly garb, and Alexander said he'd had a dream of that the night before, and so I think he even says that Alexander came to Jerusalem and offered in the temple according to the high priest's direction. Pfeiffer does point out that this is generally regarded as unhistorical. Josephus was known sometimes to kind of exaggerate things, or sometimes just miss it, whether that's intentional or not. So we don't know that there's any truth to that, but that is a story that is told by Josephus. So take that for what it's worth. It's uninspired history, but it may have indeed happened that way. But Jewish tradition does show him in a friendly light, and that's what Pfeiffer says. Even though that account by Josephus is regarded as unhistorical, it does show how the Jews were friendly toward Alexander. They were not antagonistic like some folks were. So bear that in mind. 331 BC, Alexander's going to retrace his steps through Palestine, Syria. Long story short, he meets the Persian army in its home territory. This is the Battle of Gaugamela. I think there was a movie made about this maybe a few years ago. I think it was maybe called Alexander or something. I want to say it had one of the big-time A-listers of Hollywood in it or something. Am I dreaming this, or does anybody know? Was there not a movie about Alexander recently? It was?
Yeah, but I don't know if it was about that battle.
No, I don't think it was necessarily about that battle, but it was about Alexander's conquest, right? Okay. I thought I was losing my mind there, and everybody looking at me like, finally saw a couple of people nodding, and I was like, okay, I'm not crazy. The Babylonian conquest, he did conquer Babylon, of course, but it was much like with the days of Cyrus. If you recall, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, they didn't really look at him as a conqueror so much as a liberator, especially after Xerxes, because Xerxes had gotten rid of their temples and all that. And so here comes Alexander, and he's going to rebuild those temples, and so they're happy. 20 days after he left Babylon, Alexander enters into Susa. The treasure of the palace of Darius I there was his for the taking. And so having plundered Susa, he went on to Persepolis, which was reported to be the richest city in the world. Pfeiffer says this: historians are puzzled by the cruelty of Alexander at Persepolis. The men were all slain, the women were enslaved. Macedonians fought one another over the plunder. Well, I don't know that I can, I certainly can't just explain that. But I will say this: I had a teacher in high school. He taught us world history. In fact, he's one of the reasons why I love history so much to this day. He was just a teacher who had a tremendous impact on me and was just a tremendous teacher, period. But he told us, he never gave us any kind of, or at least I don't remember any kind of a source to look this up and verify the truthfulness of it or not. But he told us that Alexander the Great had a drinking problem. And so if that is the case, that would probably explain what happened at Persepolis. Because he said there were times when Alexander the Great would go on a bender and would order troops to just burn things down and destroy things and just kind of enjoy that, to watch it just, kind of like, sometimes I had a friend that was in the Army several years ago, and he was on a tour in Iraq, and he said one day they're out, it's not really much going on, and so they were told to clear an area or something like that, I think, and there were these just abandoned vehicles that were out there, and so they just decided to get out the big guns, tank guns and things like that, and they just wanted to, they were just guys letting off steam, blowing stuff up, and so that was what they were doing. So maybe that's what Alexander the Great was doing there when he would get to drinking. And again, I don't have a source to give you for that, so I can't say for sure if that's true or not. But everybody looks at what happened there at Persepolis, and they're so confused. How would Alexander do that? How could he do that? He was so into history, and he respected history and arts and things like that so much. So why would he do something so out of character? Alcohol will make you do a lot of things out of character. Newsflash, but that would explain it. But again, we don't know for sure if that's what happened or not. But that was what happened at Persepolis. Mr. Zen was my teacher's name. He told us that there was, I forget where, but said there was one time he had his troops burn. It was one of his drinking binges, and had one of his troops burn, or some of his troops burn, I think, a library. And that when he sobered up, he literally wept because he was just so frustrated with himself for what he did. But the story Mr. Zen told was he was an alcoholic, not just a drinking problem, but he was an alcoholic, and so he kept going back to that and going back to that and back to that, and really just sad if that was the case. And certainly history is the worse for it, or at least what we have today, what we have left from history is the worse for it. But by 330 BC, Darius was dead. Alexander assumed the title of the Great King, and so he's conquered Persia. He continues eastern conquest. He goes into Bactria and what is now modern-day Russian territory. That cost him 3 years of bitter fighting. And basically just say that to say this: as a gesture of reconciliation, Alexander married a lady named Roxana, who was a Bactrian princess. And the Punjab region of India was the limit of Alexander's conquest. His army at that point says, we're not going any further. And that kind of takes you to sort of his last years, which were crowned with tragedy pretty much, unfortunately. But again, Alexander was convinced the Greek way of life was superior to any other. He began his crusade with a missionary zeal, as Pfeiffer puts it. When he was recognized as a son of Ammon in Egypt, he took a major step away from that Greek ideology. Even in Persia, he adopted Persian dress, began to rule as an Oriental type of ruler. And so that kind of leads you to the tragedy of his later years, because he finds misrule on the part of the officials left in charge of Susa when he gets back. That he also finds that there's resentment to his own rule that is growing. In Greece, a lot of people were scandalized, as Pfeiffer puts it, to find out he had executed his own nephew, the historian Callisthenes. The Greeks were angered when they found out that he wants to be treated as a god. That's not the Hellenist way. So that upset people. Macedonian officers resented his commands to mingle with Persians, take Persian wives. They didn't like that. And then, of course, it just is overall becoming more oriental in his ways. That resulted in a mutiny, which was put down. But again, you see the problems. Alexander had planned a sea voyage around Arabia in 323, but he died of a fever before he made that voyage. He was only 33 years old when he died. His only son was born to Roxana, but it was after he had already died. But kind of summarizing Pfeiffer's last little bit there on that chapter on Alexander, in so short a life, he conquered more territory than any of his predecessors. He never really had time to mold the government of his empire into a cohesive whole, but the 11 years from crossing the Dardanelles till his death, it absolutely changed the course of human history. And we understand, looking back, he was not just acting on his own. He was not under some kind of miraculous control, but God in his providence was manipulating the affairs of history, making everything just right for the fullness of time when Jesus would come into this world. As Pfeiffer says, Hellenism was to outlive its militant apostle. Now, when Alexander dies, what happens is, it's 323 BC, he dies, there's no heir. Yes, Roxana has a son born after Alexander dies, but again, he's just, newborn baby. The Diadochoi, as it's called, or successors of Alexander, though, seized power before this child could reach maturity. In fact, one of them, named Cassander, actually decided, I'm just going to solve this problem and I'm going to kill Roxana and her infant child. There's no limit, it seems, to the depths, at the depths to which some of these men will sink to try to hold on to or gain power. Alexander had a lot of able generals, but nobody really stood out as a logical successor. And so within just a few years, 315 BC, after about 7 years of struggle, you have 4 outstanding leaders who appear. And this is kind of a major thing. And this is the main thing of this map. The smaller print that you probably can't necessarily read from the back, these little boxes, if I can get my pointer to work, these little boxes with the red print, that's not as important. I mainly wanted this for the color mapping because 4 people will emerge as kind of taking over Alexander's empire. It's split up. And it's not split up because they sat down at a table and said, okay, you know what? Why don't you take this area and I'll take this area? No, it's split up because this is how it fell out when they fought over it. Antigonus is one. He occupied the country from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. That's kind of your yellow color here. You can see he's got a lot. He was very, very powerful. Then you have Cassander. That's the one who murdered Roxana and her child. And basically, Cassander, ironically, he's the one that carried out that heinous act, but he only ends up with Macedonia up here. That's pretty much it. This right here, this looks similar, but that's actually a different, because that's the next one. That's Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt and the southern part of Syria. When we say Syria, southern part of Syria, that's getting up in here, kind of northeast of Egypt. And then, of course, you have Lysimachus, who is the ruler of Thrace, and that's the greenish color. Where is it? Up here next to Cassander. I don't know why I can never seem to. There we go. It's just not a good contrast. But anyway, it's up there in the top left. You see that greenish color? That's Thrace. Ptolemy's number 1 general was a man named Seleucus. And that name is important because we're going to talk later on about the Seleucids, the Seleucid dynasty, and a man named Antiochus, several men named Antiochus. He wasn't one of the ones to whom this all fell out, but he was kind of the right-hand man of Ptolemy. And so what's going to happen is he's going to have an important role in the history of Palestine. time gets away, doesn't it? So let me kind of summarize that just to say this. Seleucus, he's going to come into play much more later on, because what happens is Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, those other three, they form an alliance, and they say, look, we got to do something about Antigonus. I mean, look at his territory. He's envisioning himself, Antigonus is, as being kind of a second Alexander. He's going to conquer the world. So the three of them get together and they say, guys, we got to do something. If we don't hang together, we're going to hang apart. He's going to pick us off and he's going to conquer us. So they decide to go against him. And so they did, and they were able to defeat him. I'm trying to summarize a whole lot right here. There's so much. I'm going to refer you back to Pfeiffer's book because there's so much that I want to say. I'm just running out of time. Oh, that's the ever-present problem when you teach a class like this. There was during this time, of course, basically, I can sum a lot of this up by saying this. Here's your Palestinian area right here, kind of the bottom of the yellow, Antigonus, and the top of this purplish color where Ptolemy is. Of course, you hear Ptolemy, you always think Israel. That's what I mean, Israel, Egypt, and that's why, because ruled that area mainly. But there's going to be these clashes over and over and over again, and guess who's caught right in the middle and just gets stomped all over? It's kind of like the man who's had a terrible day at work, and the wife's yelling at him, and he goes home and he kicks the cat. Poor thing's not done anything. he's just taking it out on somebody. That's what happens sometimes. I used to work at Blue Cross, and I felt like sometimes I just wanted to say, sir, are you having a bad day? You want to talk about it? Because, I didn't do anything to you, okay? It's just sometimes people take their frustrations, their anger out on somebody else. And that's what happened many times with the area of Palestine where the Jews were. Here comes somebody, I'm going to go and I'm going to conquer Ptolemy, and I'm going to rule Egypt. And it didn't work out so well. He gets defeated. And now I got to turn tail and go home. But while I'm going home, I'm so mad that I lost that battle, and I'm going to take it out on those Jews. And this happened a lot. And a lot of times they would attack the Jews on Saturday. Why? The Jews aren't going to defend themselves on the Sabbath day. Josephus has there's a insert in Pfeiffer's chapter where Josephus he almost says, it sounds to me almost like he's saying the dummies, they were holding on to this rule that was not necessarily meant to be like that. And he's saying they foolishly were so holding on to that rule about the Sabbath they wouldn't even defend themselves. And it happened at least a couple or three different times during this time period where somebody would attack on the Sabbath and they don't even defend themselves. But Ptolemy, he would kind of encroach north toward the Palestinian area, and then Antigonus, and that's why you see this kind of this downward wedge. But Antigonus would drive him back, and so finally they're gonna combine again against Antigonus. This was 301 BC. Lysimachus, this time it's Seleucus, but he's kind of working on behalf of Ptolemy. Seleucus has his own holdings, but it's kind of one of those weird things. He's sort of technically considered Ptolemy's general, but he's basically a ruler in his own right. So it's him, Cassander, and Lysimachus. They conspire or combined to defeat Antigonus. This time, Antigonus dies on the battlefield. So that's the end of his dreams of world conquest. His son Demetrius managed to hang on to Macedonia and over here the Phoenician coast of Tyre. That's about it. And that kind of continues more or less with that family for a while, but that was just about it as far as his family and what they held on to. But here's the thing, Ptolemy had remained on the sideline. He didn't really get involved in the fighting this time himself. So the other guys decide, we three did the fighting, so it seems to me we should get the spoils. And so it was decided that Seleucus was going to take his share instead of Ptolemy. But in the meantime, Ptolemy takes possession of the land. And there's a quote from the historian Diodorus that's in Pfeiffer's book, and he basically mentions that they get together, Seleucus and Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's kind of like, hey, this is what we agreed upon, this is the way it needs to be, and Seleucus is sort of saying, well, you didn't really participate, so kind of makes sense that the ones who did the fighting and kind of carried the load should get the spoils of war. Ptolemy's kind of like, well, I'm already here. I'm occupying the land. What are you just going to like come and go to war against me? I mean, we're old friends. And Seleucus says something to the effect of, this is quoting from Pfeiffer. It is a direct quote from the historian Diodorus. But he says, Seleucus replied, it was quite fair for those who fought the battle should dispose the territory. With regard to Col, Syria, that's the Palestinian area, he would not for the present, Seleucus says he would not for the present, for the sake of friendship, take any action. Later on, he would consider the best way of treating friends who tried to grasp more than was their right. So he kind of says, well, for the sake of our friendship, we'll let this go for right now, but we're not done here. And all that is just to say that you're going to see Seleucus, and he's going to come into a ruler in his own right, and he's going to rule this Syrian area. And Seleucus, his descendants, Ptolemy and his descendants are going to be like oil and water for the next long while. And some of this is detailed in some of this is prophesied in such detail in the book of Daniel that skeptics, atheists, modernists, they scramble and scratch and claw to try to late date the book of Daniel because there's no other way to explain those prophecies except divine revelation, because they were so far in advance and the details are absolutely stunning. We've studied that before in a class on the book of Daniel. But Syria is going to become basically a part of three domains, and then you're going to see these battles begin between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And we'll kind of sum all that up next week. I had so much more I wanted to cover today. I'm going to have to speed up. And I thought I had summarized a lot today. I'm going to have to summarize more, I guess, to be able to cover. But what we want to get to is talking about Antiochus the Great. Don't really want to mention a whole lot about him. There's not a whole lot to say, but he was called Antiochus the Great. But it's his son, Antiochus, would be Antiochus the Third. Epiphanes, he called himself, the illustrious. You know, some of these rulers so humble, right? But he almost declared himself to be a god, and he has a great, great bearing on Jewish history during this time, and the Maccabees and all of that. So we'll talk about that next week, and you know, as I said, we'll summarize that quickly, but there is a lot to say about that, and we'll cover that and what's going on with the Jews as a result of Alexander's influence. Thank you very much. We'll have a break, as we always do, before our worship period.